What's up?
What up?
This is the SeerNova podcast.
SeerNova podcast.
And this is season 2, episode 2. So, yeah, here's a little intro because I just made it.
Dude, everyone's like, you must have spent 8 years making that.
I know, right? That's the hardest thing.
Greg's like, that's literally the hardest thing I've done in my entire life.
Yeah. It was like, oh, I need to make one of those because we didn't have that on the first episode when we came back from doing this. Okay, cool. So we have one guest today, not 20 of them. His name is Justin Coke, not Cook. I don't know why I said Cook. That's just like for some reason.
I think it's because he's hungry, not thirsty.
I am hungry. He is the founder of Coca-Cola, obviously. We're going to be talking about that. So I'm going to bring him on. What is going on?
He's even got the red shirt, so like now everyone's like, "Holy crap!" Like it is the Justin Coke. I didn't know.
No, I think family lore is my great grandpa changed her name to this because his relatives were too skeezy, so he dropped a letter, which God knows what they were up to because he was a piece of shit. But anyway, yeah,
like those bastards were selling heroin. It's like we're a Coke family.
Yeah, so I don't know. Everybody says Cook the first time through, so it's either that or they call me Jason. My own mom's called me Jason, so it happens.
Wow.
There's nothing to do with him walking around with a machete every now and then.
So besides not being the founder of Coke, what do you do?
Well, I write comics. Right now we've got Edge of Darkness on Kickstarter live. It's it's a very strange, it's a far future biopunk thing where humanity's been living under the sea for millions of years, and they swim around in these suits. They're like biological suits, so like it's a giant spatchcock squid that sort of folds around you when you become the squid, and experience the world as the animal. So that's what's going on right now. During my day job as lawyer, I have my own little law firm, and it's not. No, you don't need to be that impressed.
Okay.
And that's what I do I sell some insurance, that kind of stuff. So,
That's cool. Yeah. I deliver uniforms to people, so who has the better job?
Yeah, ask yourself that.
Well, there's something to be said for dependability, right?
Yeah.
If I don't make payroll, that's my problem, right? So, But so we're talking about creating engaging villains, huh?
Yeah. So let's get started with that. First question. So villain origin stories, like we've talked about this a million times. Not just villains, just people, like characters in general, about the origin story. We've had previous guests on, and there's one in particular that basically said not to do origin stories of your characters yet because nobody knows who they are. We can go in depth with that again for the millionth time, or we can just have a new take. So, how important is a well-crafted origin story in making it?
I don't want one at all. Like Darth Vader was terrifying before we saw him with pimples. You know what I mean? Like he's way less scary now that I've seen, him try to get a date to prom. So there's it depends on the villain, I guess. Like I think a lot of the time they're better left we don't need to see their man pain episode that caused, whatever kind of bullshit you're going to use to make them a villain. And the more vague that is, I feel like the more the reader can kind of project their anxieties onto the villain a little bit. So it really depends. I really can't think. I mean, who would you say is a villain whose backstory added depth to the character?
Okay, Dylan, go. Dylan is muted, so.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was sitting it because I was typing earlier. I want to make sure I wasn't getting here. So yes, I absolutely have one, and it's one of the best bad guys because of their background in Batman, and they started off with his origin story, but immediately they start off with you seeing him being a villain, but you immediately learn his origin stories, and that is Mr. Freeze. And the reason he's an interesting villain is because he's only a villain to save his wife. He just prioritizes his wife over anyone else on the planet, right?
Yeah.
That right there is a great origin story. But I do agree that sometimes exploring a villain's background can kind of dispel the mysteriousness of that villain. Like the Joker is interesting because he starts off as a psychopath, and then everybody wants to know the origin stories. And that's what Greg was referring to earlier, that we basically discussed in great length how we want to start jumping into the action a lot sooner, because I feel like origin stories only matter if you already know how interesting the character becomes. Like you don't want to see an origin of some guy if you have no idea what the outcome is. It's like watching somebody play. Have you ever seen the show Rick and Morty?
Yeah.
Do you remember when he puts on that VR headset and he plays as like Roy or something like that?
Yeah. He sells carpet.
Yeah, I feel like that would be the equivalent of having an origin story for a villain, is like watching somebody just live their life randomly until they become this crazy villain, where it's not that interesting unless you're like, oh, is today the day? And I thought about it because I love the show Gotham, and it's because it tells these origin stories, but it's because I'm like, which one is it? Is he almost there? Oh, is this when he snaps? Like I'm anticipatory of the thing that I want to see, which is when he becomes the cool hero. That makes the origin story fun. But I don't think that if you start with one, that it's necessarily a good thing.
Well, I mean, wouldn't the reader just think that they're the main character if you started with their origin story? I mean,
yeah, but there's been characters like that. There's been like horror films where you're watching somebody and then all of a sudden you're just like, oh wait, this guy's a psychopath, So it does, like, that's not an uncommon thing. I guess it depends on the stuff like genre would definitely matter, and then the purpose or the plot of the story.
Well, I mean, with everything with writing, there are no rules. There's only maybe general guidelines at best, and if it's time to break it. I read Riddler Year One by Paul Dano recently, which is basically I guess it's basically a lead in to the Batman movie from the Riddler's perspective, and I really liked it quite a bit. Now, I don't know that it was, well, I haven't seen the movie, but he really captured that incel energy. I guess I feel like if I always view things in terms of enchantment. So if what you're doing is increasing the buy-in from the audience, like it's really good stuff, it's really, compelling, then go for it. If it's, love is like sand, don't. So I don't. That makes sense. The villains, I think, I feel like this is almost a cliche at this point, but Heath Ledger's Joker really landed with me because he was saying things that you kind of think, right? Like in real life, I don't think they would have talked. Those people on that boat would have just blown each other up. That's what would have really happened, right? So he had a point.
100%.
Settling to me. And that is what makes it compelling. I like to have villains that have their own motivation. You can always have conflict in worldviews, right? Like if everybody thinks 98% of the world's full of shit, right? So you can always find somebody, if you can understand other points of view, you can usually write a compelling villain that makes sense to themselves, and then that will make sense to the reader, I think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but a lot of the times it kind of seems like villains are basically people who saw the same problem a hero did, but then just are narcissistic about it rather than pessimistic about it rather than optimistic about it. One view is there's a problem and I can solve it. The other view is there's a problem, So, I don't give a crap. Like, I'll just do what I'm going to do then. Like, this,
Mhm.
like that's basically the whole point of the Joker and Batman is Batman thinks he can fix it and that there's a good light in people that can come out. And the Joker's like, no, they're actually all inherently bad. Like, so why not just poke the bear and have fun watching it?
Yeah. I mean, that definitely is in there. I mean, I shouldn't talk about my own work because no one's even read it, but I have a villain in SWAT, my other project, who is I think she's, well, that is too complicated. No one's read it, so let's move on. But Cormac McCarthy in oh God, Blood Meridian, right? The judge is there, and he's kind of Joker-esque in that he's kind of hyper violent, and what he says kind of makes sense in a crazy way, and that's part of what makes him work. He's the judge from Blood Meridian. I think is actually one of those characters that sort of been the inspiration for a lot of villains, because when you read Blood Meridian at this point, you're like, oh, I've seen this cliche. But he made the cliche, and it's everyone else that's been imitating him for like 40 years. So,
yeah. In our flagship, the title Seer Chronicles, we actually, before we figured out, oh, we're not going to do origin stories. The beginning of that is literally the villain's origin story and the like hero's origin story. So it's like flip flop, and it's definitely like Jurassic. Like, one goes one way and the other one goes the opposite way. So that's the only reason why like it's okay that we did the origin for the villain, because it shows like, oh, this guy went completely off the rails, and this guy's like, oh, well, I guess I'm the hero type. So
yeah, like if it works, it works. There's definitely no set rules about it, but I think part of the problem I see in a lot of pop culture these days is the compulsion to try to answer every conceivable question. Hey, John, glad you're here. Every conceivable question, and then it just sort of sucks the fun out of things, right? Like, do we really have to know? Well, I don't know.
Like The Sopranos, like the ending of Sopranos, people hated it, and yet it made it like long lasting. Like people always remember it. It's like leaving things up to mystery sometimes. Like damn, I don't remember where I was listening to this, but I think I was in some debate about should artists share the meaning of their artwork, right? Like if it's just a painting, right? And like what was the meaning behind it? What was the inspiration, etc.? Or should you let people basically digest it? And I think it should be both, in the sense that I should be able to enjoy it and absorb it as it is. But later, if you'd like to share it so that we can all reflect on, wow, that's how it made me feel, but this is where your perspective was. I think that's interesting, which is kind of the same as not telling the origin story first and then sharing it later once people have digested it. Because like it's a way to basically get both worlds without ruining that initial impression of like, like exactly, like, who's the Joker? Why is he so mad at Batman? Like, that's fun to wonder that. Like, if there's no curiosity, there's no reason to keep watching. Like, if you already know what's going to happen, you just know what's going to happen. And that's the reason why Joker is such a fun character, because he's such a wild card.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the way I see it is like if you leave it vague, everybody can have their perfect origin story for the Joker, the one that hits them the hardest, right? They can imagine it, write fan fiction about it. And so you go from everyone being happy to I pick one, and it turns out that he couldn't get a date to prom, and now he's mad, and now I'm bored, right? Or something like that. So sometimes I think to me, a lot of the fun of it is to kind of create situations that let you think about things. So I'm not necessarily trying to get you to believe what I think about the situation. I'm just playing around and hoping that you'll play too. If that makes sense. So.
Yeah. And like I said too, I think that is probably better to do it longer. Like, let people wonder longer. And then the interesting thing with the Joker is there's so many origin stories, like you said. It's almost like pick and choose. It's almost like these are imaginary ones in his own head every time a new one's told. Like which makes it even more interesting. It's like actually all of them are true. They're in his head. They're just made up. He's just a psychopath or schizophrenic or whatever it is. Like, so there's tons of like ways to make that interesting. But I definitely think, yeah, just going like, here's step 1, step 2, step 3. I shared a video with Greg the other day. I think it was actually like the South Park creators talking about storytelling. And it was this whole idea where if your story goes, well, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, it's a very boring story. Like, stories should never be this and that and that. It should be this happened, and therefore that happened. And so this happened. You know what I mean? Like, it's the entire story should be like stuff forcing the story to move along. But if you have an end goal in mind, which is why the not doing the origin stories, I think, is better in the beginning, especially if like the whole origin story isn't a fantastic tale like that, where if you're just trying to get the villain, you know, you're just like, and this happened, and then this happened, and now he's a villain. It's like, oh, thank God he's a villain now, as opposed to like I said, like Gotham was a very interesting way to do it, where you just see someone getting tormented, and then he slips a little bit, but he recovers, but no, he's not there yet. Like, it's a very interesting way to go about it. And that was one of the reasons why one of our stories we drastically changed before we had it created. Was Greg had this plot arc where eventually, a bunch of people ended up in the same spot. And I'm like, why? Like, why are they all there? That doesn't make any sense. Like, they all just landed in this one spot they've never been in. And so we had to come up with reasons why they would be there. So we had to cause, like, somebody broke into somebody's house. It scared somebody. So they fled. And then they went to meet somebody near their house. And their house happens to be located there. That's why they were able to get there. Like, so this happened. And, you know, and not, and then this happened. It's like, this happened, therefore he fled and landed here.
So the characters are driving the
exactly. And so I think that's that's probably the answer. I think what was it? Aaron was asking about the. I think it was Aaron. Was it Aaron? Yeah. This question here. You say it is the answer not telling origin. Oh, where'd he go? Is the answer not telling origin stories, or is it in the marketing? It's probably both. It's like, I think that if you can tell a really good origin story, there he is. He's back.
I'm sorry, I don't know. I hit something.
No worries.
Comments, and then I hit
the question below, is the answer not telling origin stories, or is it in the marketing? I think it's probably both, because I think that telling an origin story, if it's not for the sole purpose of just getting to the good stuff, then it's probably not worth it. But if the origin story is the interesting story, then that's fine. But I think a lot of the times, especially in the indie world, people create characters that are fascinating. And they're like, okay, now we got to come up with why they're like that. And it's like, that's not a good way to do it. So like our characters, we the ones that we did tell the origin story, we went back and rewrote it several times. We're like, that's not interesting enough. We don't want it to just happen, right? So for example, even our main hero, the reason he ends up getting powers is because he is that guy that wants to run in first. The initial comic didn't show it that well. So we rewrote it and made it so that even from the very beginning, when they're at the fire station, he's the one in front of everybody. He's the one rushing ahead. So you're getting more like an understanding of this character. Like, oh, he always is getting there first. He wants to save people. Like, this is what he's meant to do. As opposed to, he's just a firefighter and just disobeyed his boss and ran into a burning building. It's like, no, he always is rushing in first. And like that, like, if you don't have that stuff in mind, and you're just like, yeah, guy runs into fire, building collapses. Now he has superpowers. It's not as interesting of a story. And I think that's equally true with villains, is that like, you have to make it so that there's a reason behind each step that they take that's based on their character, not just for the sake of the plot.
No, I think we're basically on the same page of
exactly.
The character needs to drive if the character is driving the story, it's a lot more interesting. And that's when I'm writing, I know I'm cooking with fire when the characters are doing things I don't want them to do. I'm like, fuck, man, come on, that's really inconvenient. But then they do it anyway. That's when it's good stuff, I think. And when I'm, if the characters are ever shopping for me, that is a go back 2,000 words, delete everything, and start over, because something went wrong. If they're fucking shopping, you screwed up. I think one of the things I like about comics is that it sort of forces you to cut the shit, right? You have 21 pages, maybe 22, 23 on the outside. go. And so it makes me always trim the fat a little bit and get to the point. And I think that really increases the amount of fun, really. And I have a tendency to get bogged down in minutia or something, but because sometimes they take quite a while. But with comics, it kind of forces the action, and it's always important to have like the emotional. If it's not emotionally resonant, whatever you're doing, probably just delete it. Honestly,
Yeah.
you know.
Nice. So balancing power and vulnerability. What do you think makes a villain's weaknesses as important as their strengths? How do you balance these elements to create a believable and engaging antagonist?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think the weaknesses are.
He's like, man, that is a lot deeper than I was prepared for today.
I kind of have a different thing where I try to make it so it feels more like a fist fight, right? Like usually the villain is cast as like, I'm impossibly powerful to beat, but I get kind of bored with that, and I want them to be mixed to the point where it could go either way, but they could also kill the hero, right? They're doing damage to the hero at the same time. And so it's more like a fist fight than the standard, Darth Vader type of thing where Sidious is just pushing him around. So I think the weaknesses are really important. I don't know. I don't usually have like, I guess I'm picturing that vulnerable spot in a video game where you have to hit the boss, in the neck,
in the back of the knee.
Yeah, that's kind of messing me up here a little bit because I don't really like that. But everyone has.
Did you ever watch The Boys?
Yeah, I haven't seen the latest season, but yeah.
But you've seen Homelander and his mom, right? Like he's not his mom; it's the lady that takes care of him, right?
That
he
kills.
Yeah, like the spoiler. Yeah. Well, I didn't say who it was, so it's not too big of a spoiler. And he ends up killing people, so that's not really that big of a spoiler. But yes, that person is his weakness at first, right? Like that's kind of the interesting thing is like that's like I feel like there's a lot of villains that have something like that. Again, Joker's one of those interesting ones who just seems to not care about anything, which I think that. So you're mentioning a lot like rules earlier. I think that there are a lot of rules about writing, but the whole point is that the way you make something interesting is breaking those rules, right? You don't break all of the rules because then it's not a good story. You're just like bat falls sky, like like there needs to be structure to sentences, a plot arc. There needs to be a beginning, middle, end. But there's ways to break that apart and make it something unique and new. That's like the Pulp Fiction, right? There's a plot arc. They just rearranged it, so they followed the rule of beginning to end. They just reordered how it's done. So, like, I think that's what's interesting is that for like the Joker, like everybody has a weakness, and then Joker's rule is that like, yeah, he is just the crazy one. Right? That like his only weakness is that he's human, I guess, in the sense that he can be killed. But like it's an interesting way that like nothing phases him.
Yeah. I was going to say something. I don't know why I'm spacing right now. I think it's the appearance of breaking the rules while not actually breaking the rules that is what really kills, right? Like Game of Thrones' whole thing is they fucked with your head for so long with the first 2 books, making you think like they bring you into Ned Stark. He's 7 out of 10 Keanu's, maybe 6, right? He's a little too old. He's already successful, but he's dumb and he's good with a sword. Okay, we can work with this. You spend an entire book with thinking he's the big hero, and then they chop his head off. Then they roll Robb Stark up. He's 8 out of 10 Keanu's, right? He's an angry young man with a father to avenge and stuff like that. Awesome. Also hotter, younger, better, more fantasy protagonist in every way. Brutally slaughter him and even more. And now you're so confused that you don't notice that it's a completely standard fantasy story from that point out, right? Like Tyrion has plot armor, Jaime has plot armor. They tricked you into thinking, so they appeared to violate the rules without actually violating the rules at all. And then the genius of it, I mean, beyond the 2-book mislead, is the way they slow played you into Jon Snow. Like,
Yeah.
like they hinted at the other two boys might be the one or whatever, and then they just kind of wormed your way into Jon Snow.
They warmed your way into the snow.
And then so I really appreciated that. Tricking the audience is the writer's greatest thing to do. Just
Yeah, like misleading. Yeah, just like getting them to get like you just follow this. So it's like magic though. That's what makes magic entertaining. It's like they're not pulling off magic. They're distracting you long enough to make a feat seem unbelievable. It's like that's all it is. And so it's like it's a very cool way to storytell. That's what you're doing. Like you're creating magic and storytelling. This isn't real. This is all like it's all fantasy. Like fantasy in the sense that it's fiction, right? Like, so it's all fiction, and you're just bringing someone's brain through this journey that never happened. And like, that's a really cool way to, create magic in one's life, essentially. So yeah, you're just misleading them into believing them that they're in this world, or that this character is going this way when really everything's going this way. It's like, yeah, it's definitely fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's what audiences are up to their ass in stories. I mean, they've been that way since they were kids, right? We're constantly surrounded by quality writing. And so you really have to try hard to break that callus and actually get people to feel. Because if it's too predictable or whatever, they're just going to be like, I've seen this a million times. I mean, like I remember my wife watching Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and I was there for like the first 5 minutes, and I told her the entire plot of the episode, because I've seen this episode so many times, even though I've never seen this show before in my life. And then at the end, she's like, "How did you know?" And I'm like, because that's just how it works, right? Like,
dude, it's interesting though about stuff like that, because I've thought about that too, where it's like you don't want it to be predictable. But one thing that's interesting is the fact that that, but you write stories. There's definitely like a set of rules that if you know all of the rules of writing, that you can predict most stories. And even if there's like an alteration, like the Ned Stark thing, like it was still a possibility in your head, right? Where some people, it's like that was never even a possibility. Like like all the stories that have ever been told, this is how it goes. Oh no, like it's different now. And so I do think it's interesting that some very successful things do follow an arc like that. They're very easily noticeable if you understand like the hero's journey, for example, like the baseline of a storytelling arc. And so I don't think that it's a bad thing to do that. I think it's a bad thing to do that on repeat, right? It's because what's it called? Like The Simpsons, Family Guy, they all have a very similar arc through their whole thing. They just have like little nuggets of like interesting things throughout that just keep you entertained. So if the sole purpose is entertainment, I think that those types of story arcs are still fine, but without little flavors of like, like, oh, left turn, like what was that? I think that those are necessary, but if you can do it a huge left turn in the story arc, I think that's what makes stories that are memorable. Like the ones that are like, holy crap, like that was an incredible, quest I just went on, an incredible journey I just went on. Whereas those shows, those quick little snippets of stories are just interesting. They're entertaining. So they're still going to be digested. They're just not going to be immortalized.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. With The Simpsons, I mean, my God, that show how is it still on? I mean,
it's because they're telling the future. That's all they're doing. Like you've seen all those ones where like they're like, here's an episode, and then like 12 years later, that exact scene happens. And you're like, what the hell's going on?
Yeah. As a fan of dark comedy, it's been a really interesting decade, I gotta say. Yeah.
Now we just need a portal gun and some crazy guy spitting all over the place.
Yeah, and I mean the thing with related to story structure, I think story structure, having that the hero's journey type thing, that's what people want. They just want to feel like that's not what they want.
Yeah,
that's it. And I think people might not be able to state like, oh, this is stage 4 of the tragedy. It's the exhaustion phase leading into
this. Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. Like where you can't like go, oh, this is when it happened while watching it, right? You might be able to have you ever seen the Book of Eli?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, I'm not going to ruin it. No matter how many things have ruined it out there, you should watch it at some point because it's a great way. It's a great story and interesting the whole way through. And then like M. Night Shyamalan type of twist at the very end, to the point where you cannot watch it a second time the same way. It's impossible. So like it's interesting because you could watch something like The Office over and over again and be entertained by it. But then something like this is like like you can only do it one time, which is why I don't want to ruin it. It's like it is. I think it's one of my like favorite movies, and I've only had to watch it once, and I remember the whole story. Like, which I don't normally do. I normally have to watch a movie a couple of times to remember the whole story. But I think that's what that's what I mean. Like, there's different types of interesting works, right? Like one, I think he might have passed away by now, but there was a comedian. I think it was The Amazing Jonathan, I think is what his name was, and he did magic work. And he actually was like, he was goofing off the whole time. Like, he's like, here, take a card. He hands a card. They take it. He goes, 1 second. He turns around, grabs a giant deck of cards. He goes, all right, put it back in here. Right. Like he's spoofing the whole time. But every once in a while, he makes a cool little trick, but it's nothing tremendous. But then at like the end of one of his segments, he then like puts himself behind a curtain. The curtain drops. It had to have been 3 seconds tops. And he is 50 yards away in the bleachers. And you're like, how the hell did that guy just do? Like, he's been entertaining us comedically. It was a stand-up routine. That's what this was. And then that dude just teleported 50 yards. What just happened? Did I just watch? What was that movie where the guy, like, he like fell into a bucket and he duplicated himself someplace? Do you know what I'm talking about? He tested it with a hat and there was like hats appearing in the woods. And then eventually he's like, I wonder if I could do it myself. And he made like, quote, real magic, but he was cloning himself over and over again. He would kill himself.
I haven't seen the movie, but I know exactly which one you're talking about.
Yeah, I can't remember, but yeah, basically like the whole thing is like, this is what this guy just did in real life. And you're like, what the hell did I just watch? Like, how did he just do that? And I love that because that's a way that he basically did the, what's it called? The Office style is funny and entertaining. I could watch it over and over again, but then also had this, wow, like I'll never forget that act now. That's awesome. As opposed to like, I might watch an episode 300 times and be like, oh, I forgot about that. Yeah. But it's still entertaining. So it is definitely an interesting, back and forth there.
I Googled him. He died a couple of years ago.
Yeah, did. There's a Hulu thing about it. Okay. In your opinion, should a great villain evoke sympathy from the audience, or is it important that they are feared? How do you strike that balance in your work?
I think it depends on what you want. I mean, I could definitely see a sympathetic villain, but I could also, like I said, I think Darth Vader is just terrifying in the original trilogy, and he's pretty much the standard, right, for awesome villainy.
I was just about to say the fact that you said standard, like in this case, like what would make a great villain? So in your case, do you think that it is more the feared villain where it's just terrifying?
Well, it just depends on what you're going for. I mean, it's all entirely, everything you're doing is context based, right? So sometimes you might want a villain that's more sympathetic, where you understand what he's doing and why he's doing it, and you kind of like, I really wish you'd gone a different way or something like that. But and that's totally valid. But also sometimes it needs to be a fucking alien, right, bursting out of your chest, right? So it just depends.
What would be an example of a sympathetic one that you enjoyed as much as someone like Darth Vader?
Well, I mean, I know I'm harping on Riddler year one quite a bit, but that one was sympathetic. I found him irritating and annoying, but as sympathetic nonetheless. I'm trying to think of. I'm not really good at coming up with examples off the top of my head sometimes. I mean, comic book villains tend to not be. They don't invest much time in making them sympathetic. Typically, they're usually more on the fear side. It seems like, but I don't know. Do you have an example? I am blanking really hard.
I definitely think that the Mr. Freeze one's a good one, but that one's very straightforward. It's like, my wife's dying. I will do anything to save her. I happen to be brilliant in cryo. I will use that to get anything out of my way. Freeze my wife. Kill anyone who tries to stop me. Like, it's like, this is the one. Like, it's kind of interesting. One of my favorite books is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And like right at the beginning of that book, he talks about how people have different principles in their life. So you could be like family focused, spouse focused, career focused, money focused, like your group focus. Like if you're in a religion or like a fraternity or something like that, like you have these different focuses in life, and how ideally you should be principle focused, which kind of overlaps all of them without, having one thing drive your whole life. And what's it called? Mr. Freeze is a great example of what happens when you take one of those to the extreme. Like the one thing that is the most important in your life, your wife, is about to die, which means all other areas of your life can suffer and you have no problem with it. You know what I mean? Like, and obviously that's not good for you. It's not healthy for you. It can cause drastic pain in your life and those around you and all that stuff. Like if his wife wakes up and is healed, will she ever forgive him to be with him to begin with? You know, like there's all of these things that make it crazy. But I think that I'm kind of glad I was like doing that in my head, like as I'm thinking that. I think that that's actually a really good way to build a villain, is to pick an area of their life they value more than anything else, and they're willing to throw away the rest of their life to ensure that that thing's prioritized. And honestly, if you think about it, that's what a thief is: somebody who prioritizes money over everything, right? Yeah. They don't care about like if they go to jail or if they hurt somebody or stab. Like it's just you take one of those areas in life and then you just amplify that to 100 and take out all other areas, and now you have a villain. Like it's somebody who just prioritizes, like, because sometimes it's family, like sometimes it's like what's it called, Sandman from Spider-Man, right? His daughter is dying from a sickness, so he's trying to like break in and get like money just to be able to pay for her medical bills, right? That's also another good one where it's sympathetic. Now it's interesting because like again, I actually like all of those types of villains, but I also kind of agree that those Darth Vader-esque villains are also, I almost feel like more memorable because of the mysteriousness behind them, right? It's the fact that they are just this, ultra powerful evil that your good guy, who's this little guy, has to. It's the Goliath, right? It's this idea that it's like you don't know Goliath's backstory. Maybe his mom beat him when he was a kid. Now he's sad, so he kills people, right? Like, but you don't care. You just see Goliath, and Dave's ready to fight him. And you know Dave's backstory, and that's why it's cool. Like you're like this little guy who grew up on a farm and didn't have anything, worked his way up, and he's trying to fight this guy, and he was smart, and so he used his smarts to beat the giant, right? That's for whatever reason that seems like a more interesting story from that perspective, to have this villain who you don't know the backstory of, right?
Yeah, I mean Goliath getting drafted into the army and forced to fight or something like that wouldn't be as much fun, right?
Yeah. Again, it's weird though. Like from like later, that's an interesting like follow up. Like if you find out that David works his way up after beating Goliath, becomes president of the country, and then later he finds out that Goliath was enslaved into the army and he killed him, and now he feels deep regret. It's almost like the villain's origin story is valuable when it affects the protagonist.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what you're going for, right? Is, I mean, ultimately, it's a yin yang conflict that you're going for. So sometimes sometimes you can just have the death itself, Darth Vader, I choke people for fun kind of guy.
That should be on a shirt.
You can do some BDSM jokes. I don't know.
No, that's what I was saying. It should be on a shirt, probably a leather one.
Darth's choking a guy, and then it just says pineapple.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So sometimes, I mean, actually, I guess there really isn't one, but
that's what I was saying. Like, it's interesting. That's why I asked, because the question is what makes a great villain. And it's interesting because I think that a great story can have an origin for a villain, but a great villain, actually, you know what? Here's a great example of a great villain that you later find out the background, and it's interesting. And it's kind of a twist. The Sandlot. The dog is the villain. You know nothing about him. He's just this monstrous beast. And then later you find out he's actually just a dog that, people used to come onto his lawn and bother the old man, and all he was doing was defending him. But he's the villain during that whole movie.
That's they lose the baseball in the field.
Yeah. The Sandlot's where it's a new kid moves into town. He doesn't have any friends. He ends up playing baseball. They knock the ball over the fence into the old man's yard, and you can't go in there. There's the beast. They make a bunch of contraptions to try to get the thing. The beast rips it apart. And every time you see the beast before you see the dog, he's an animatronic. They made him literally look like a monster because these kids are seeing a monster. So he's ripping it apart and freaking out. And then later he's just a dog. But like that would be like an example of a story arc that kind of has this little hero's journey of the kid overcoming a villain, but then it turns out the villain's fine in the end. Actually, I sent this to Greg. Mewtwo was another one like that. Mewtwo in the first Pokemon movie, he ends up being evil this whole time. In the end, you find out that he had this realization, like, wow, like this playful thing is just as powerful as I am. Why am I miserable? I could be playful and be this powerful and not have to, feel hate in my heart. And then basically undoes all the damage that he did. Right. So like that was an interesting villain the whole time. That's sympathetic at the end. And it depends if you like Pokemon, but that's when you're a kid like that, or when we were kids and that came out, that was a great movie at the time. And there's a YouTube channel that talks about how in that movie, Mewtwo is the perfect villain, like somebody who was, basically abused, turns into the bad guy. He's ultra powerful, can do all this stuff, ultimately meets an equal force in the good, is conflicted, and then basically goodness is revealed at the end kind of thing. It was a very interesting description of it. But actually, Greg, by the way, is that the reason you came up with this, the idea today for the villains?
Yeah.
The Pokemon movie?
Yeah, we were, because I sent
so
video.
he sent a video of what he's talking about on Instagram, and I was like, oh, and so
it was someone breaking it down, like why he's the perfect villain, and it was very interesting, and I liked it a lot. But it does talk about how he goes through this arc, and how also they just left out a chunk of the movie that would make it much more understandable why he's a bad guy. Where like basically like the guy who made him, his daughter died. He recreated her soul using cloning, put her into a computer so that she could play with Pokemon that he also cloned. He then finds Mewtwo, thinking that if he creates him, that might be able to help the understanding of all. Or he finds like Mew's fossil, makes Mewtwo, puts that in the same machine, and then later the scientist finds out that these souls have like a half-life on them, and they'll eventually fade out of existence in the machine. She fades out. He's super depressed, and then he wakes up and he's like, was that all a dream? That's how the movie starts. Like, was that all a dream? And they never explain why. And apparently there's a whole like 15-minute scene cut from the movie that would have explained all that.
Yeah.
And she even explains in there how the Pokemon tears have healing powers when it's in mass, essentially, which explains how Ash gets healed at the end. Like, it was one of those things where like there's that one little 15-minute window, they remove it, and it kind of like destroyed a bunch of the understanding of why things were happening, and it makes perfect sense. He's like, there's this little girl, she says life is good, but then she's taken from me. I'm in a lab getting experimented on. I then get sold off to, or I then get introduced to Giovanni. He's like, he wants to help me. Turns out he just wants to take control of me, just like everybody else. All humans are evil. I'm going to go fly on an island and kill everybody. Like that's basically his like quick little story arc. And then again, like I mentioned, he ends up meeting a power of equal force, but he's lighthearted, Mew. And he's just like, why am I holding all this hatred when you're just as powerful? Like you could be doing this. Why aren't you doing this? And then there's this whole, like, while they're fighting this conflict, internal conflict happening. So it's in that case, I don't think he's an awesome villain, but I think the way that villain story is told, it makes an awesome story. So that's why that's why I'm thinking, I'm like, I don't think that I've ever thought of a great villain as having a sympathetic story, but I think great stories can have sympathetic villains.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, yeah, I think I see your point, right? The iconic villains usually are a little bit less
yeah, like Jason, like you have no idea. He's just murdering people.
Yeah. Dr. Moriarty, I don't think we get into, his college years or anything at any point. So yeah, but maintaining the mystery is important because, like I said, I mean, you really don't want to know about Palpatine, going to prom, or I keep saying prom. I don't know. It's an example I go to a lot in my head. It's
just funny because it's like what they were doing when they had acne, and it's like nobody cares. Like that's not
Star Wars, freaks and geeks. But I think people have an intuitive understanding of story structure, but it's on an emotional level. And then when it gets fucked up, they start nitpicking, right? Like they get really mad about Jar Jar Binks. That's not what you're mad about. You're mad about the movie.
Yeah.
But, or when Game of Thrones was falling apart, everybody blames Dave and Buster, but I'm pretty sure it's George. I think he's the one that's at fault because it's one simple fix, right? Just get rid of Jon Snow being a Targaryen. That's it. Game plan out the ending from there. They get together, they kill the Night King, they go to Winterfell or whatever, not Winterfell, King's Landing. They beat Cersei. It's the Saruman thing, right? You beat the big bad, you come back, you beat the way lamer guy that's not really a threat anymore to show that you set the world aright. And they completely botched it because it's a sex crime in Arkansas. Don't do that. Don't make your climax a sex crime in Arkansas. And that applies to Stephen King too. I mean, in it's a gangbang in a sewer, man. What the fuck are you doing?
Yeah.
But I mean, that's
I heard that a lot of his books are like that, where like the movies are much gentler on the disturbing parts, where the books are like really messed up. Like,
well,
that's what I'm glad I haven't like gone through them. I'm just like,
pretty sure he did like coke.
Oh yeah, he was on a lot of things at that point, and you can tell because once he gets sober, quality drops. Right?
See, it's funny. I don't know if that's the right way to put it. Is like, yeah, once he stopped doing cocaine, he stopped talking about sex gangbangs in the sewer with kids. I'm like, I don't know if that's a negative thing that he stopped doing that.
Well, it's not a negative for his life, and I mean, he's had a long career, but I mean, what is he? I definitely think that he got a lot. He kind of ran through a lot of his ideas, and then just, especially once he stopped getting all fucked up, just it sort of petered out. I'm sorry, but that's what happened.
Yeah, I feel like he was just tripping like crazy, and he was just writing down what he saw, and then I don't see it anymore.
I mean, for 10 years there, he was tearing it up. I mean, he was casually throwing out stories that people are still talking about today. So, all respect to Steven, please. I mean, if he's watching, I'm cool.
On our podcast.
His favorite podcast.
But everybody, that's
he's one of the 2 viewers right now.
Decade that it's insane. He was killing it for a long time, but once he sobered up, I do feel like it kind of anyway. So.
And actually, that's a good example though. All like his villains are like they had no background, right? Like that thing is insane. You have no idea like where the hell that came from or its origin story or whatever.
Well, there's going to be a prequel series,
and it's probably going to suck. You know what I'm saying? Like that's the point. It's like even the fact that you're like, oh, there's going to be a prequel. It's like like that made it less interesting.
I don't know if it's just my millennial reaction to the word prequel, because I do have a visceral reaction to the word prequel. I don't like it.
The only good prequel was the Borderlands video game.
A video game is whatever. That's fine. But it's hard for me I can't really think of a great prequel.
Oh, I can think of only one off the top of my head, at least. That was a good prequel, but it technically isn't a prequel. And it's The Hobbit coming out after The Lord of the Rings. Because technically that's a prequel, even though that's not the order it came out.
Well, no. I mean,
the films, that's what I'm saying. If you're looking at just the films, technically it's a prequel.
Well, I kind of hate the Hobbit trilogy. I mean, I guess I've only seen
even if you don't like it, but if you're looking at a prequel that's better, that can be matched to the original series in that particular case, it's at least equivalent whether or not you like it or not. You know what I mean? Would you agree that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are equally good, whether or not the good is not that good?
Well, movie-wise, I think the Hobbit trilogy is way worse than The Lord of the Rings, but I mean, the book's wonderful, but
what is Aaron's take on this?
The story started there, right? That's the thing, is that they didn't go back. It's when you go back and you start a story here, and then you try to go back and come up with something that's interesting. If it was interesting, you would have started there, I think, right?
That's kind of what I was talking about before, though, because Batman didn't have an origin story when he was created either. He was just Batman, right? Mm-hmm. And then later they explained that he was a kid and his parents were murdered. And that is actually interesting. You're like, oh, that's why a billionaire would do this. What is this?
Yeah. Okay. God bless, but I am ready to read a Batman comic or a Batman movie and not see them get shot. And not
Well, yeah,
hear
but
about
that's
it.
only
Yeah.
because they overdid it. So that's the difference, though. Like, for
Yeah.
example, you know, like, what was the hell, Wonderwall that played on the radio a billion times? Like, even the band doesn't like the song. Like,
Yeah.
it's one of those things where I think that very often we have things that are very good quality, and then big giant media companies are like, oh, I wonder how long we can make money with this. Let's do it over and over and over again. And that's why they keep redoing stories and going, oh no, parents died. That's why like Batman versus Superman was awesome, where they were like, kid, parents dead, let's move on. Like, I was like, oh, that's a good way to like fast forward that in like the first couple of seconds. like that's like, yes, you understood the assignment. Like we don't need to see, I can't read any of that crap anymore. It becomes, yeah, that's what I mean. Like once it, like it was good that it exists. You now know it. And the only reason they're retelling it is for all the people who don't know that that exists. Like there are tons of people who went and watched The Dark Knight or Batman Begins, right? And they've never heard or watched a Batman story ever. There's tons of people. That sounds crazy, but it's 100% true. Like it's impossible for it not to be true. There's too many people, right? There's people that grew up never looking at a comic book. There's like, for example, I remember growing up and someone would start talking about some show on Nickelodeon. When I was a kid, I didn't watch Nickelodeon. I watched Cartoon Network. So there were shows that all of my friends knew and I had no idea what they were. And then later I picked it all up. So
yeah, but you don't have to, you don't have to cover everything. You don't have to cover the origin story every time.
Yeah.
But I just thought of this. Do you remember the King's Test series by Margaret Weiss? Came out in the early 90s. It was a blatant Star Wars ripoff. That's not the point. It's a 3-volume series. I was 10 and I got the second volume somehow, and I didn't understand the concept of multiple books in a series. So I was obsessed with the second book. And like I was like, there's so many awesome mysteries of things they're not explaining. I really liked it. They explained it in the first book. But I had a lot of fun with that. But so I don't have a problem with not knowing things necessarily, but some people have every detail down.
I was going to say the Pulp Fiction thing. That's actually like a good example of it, though. They catch you up in this part that's not the beginning, and because of that, it's mysterious. They answer it later, so you're still wrapped up in the initial story. Like learning that Darth Vader is Luke's father is part of the arc, right? They tell you that right in the story. In the original one, right? Later they show it, but they don't need to. They already told you his origin story in just a couple of words, right? So it's like the origin story is important, but it's again, it's always after. Like he's this evil unknown villain until the hero faces him, and then he's like, "Wait, Dad!" Like, no, I wish my dad was here.
Speaking of that, this is a question that's been on my mind lately. I guess it's kind of related. What is the point of the rule of 2? I feel like it's such a devastatingly bad decision because like it goes back to the original trilogy and none of it makes sense because Darth Sidious is like, hey, Darth, that guy that when if you recruit him, I'm going to have to kill you because there's 2 of us.
Yeah.
Go find him, by the way. And if you were going to start that coup attempt that you've definitely been planning for 20 years because eventually you have to kill me, now would be the time. And here's a Death Star, right? What the fuck? And then so it undermines the climax too, because now you're like, was he killing the Emperor because he wanted to save his son, or was that just his shot? Because he was supposed to kill him either way. And these are all questions that you don't need to ask. No one needed. It was not there. You didn't need to deal with it. And then going forward, you're trapped, right? Because there's always 2 of the fuckers. So if there's 1, there's going to be a reveal for 2. If you've seen 2 of them, you can't hit around that there's a 3rd or 4th one because there's only 2 of them. And it's like you've gone into the past and ruined the past. You've gone into the future and blocked yourself in exchange for what? Like, from a perspective, what are you getting out of it?
You know what's interesting, though? Like, there's nothing wrong with setting that rule. It's the fact that they set that rule with it seemingly without a game plan on what to do about it later. Like there's a bunch of comics that were written that like go into other details throughout the universe that kind of answer a bunch of questions that aren't answered in the films or the shows. And the interesting thing is like, again, if that rule is made, having this interesting line of it is cool. But if you don't have that really laid out well, like you said, like you kind of trap yourself. And that's why it's like, if that's going to be a part of your rules, it needs to also drive plot stories because of it, as opposed to being just in the way. Like I think that's more the issue with a rule like that in your universe.
Yeah, I just don't see any gain at all from it that is remotely in line with the cost of So that's kind of like, there's bad writing, which is just stuff that kind of sucks. It fails to get you involved. And then there's writing that sort of pokes a hole in the gas tank and you're just spraying enchantment all over the road. And Star Wars has done that a lot, I think, where you're just like, what are you getting out of it? Why are you even doing it? Like midichlorians, what the fuck is the point of that? You took the spiritual core of your series, the thing that, like the thing that everyone's into, they could feel like they could be a Jedi, and you turned it into a blood test. Why? Do they also check your A1C1 to see if you're pre-diabetic? I mean, do they see if you've got chlamydia? This is fucking lame. You gave up you disenchanted your spiritual core to gain power levels, I guess.
Yeah.
Got 75,000 midichlorians to the nanogram or whatever. What kind of? I mean, it's just bad.
It's funny that's almost like the Dragon Ball series. Like I love the series, but like one of the things that's always weird is when they start very early on doing power levels, and then the problem is because they want them to keep getting stronger, the power levels become absurd, right? Like it's like, hey, with one blast you could blow up a planet, but we're gonna fight right next to it and not cause any problems. Like you know what I mean? Like stuff like that where like I totally get where certain rules will prohibit that from happening.
Yeah, that's that's the Magic the Gathering problem. Is you've always got to up it. You got to turn up the volume a little bit to keep people excited. Eventually,
but that's what's interesting too, though. Like, what's the Cowboy Bebop? One of the best animes of all time, one series long, or and then it's done, and it's memorable, and people love it, and they want more, but you don't actually need to give them more. Like that's like I think that's the part that people like. They're like, no, we should keep doing this and milk it forever. It's like, or you could make action figures, you could make posters. There's tons of other ways to make movie off of an IP or money off of an IP, but you don't need to keep stretching the story out and ruining the story. That's a pretty person is this.
Okay, I just randomly saw because I went onto the Facebook tab. It's really weird that you guys keep talking about Star Wars. James Earl Jones just died.
Oh, is that? I just got a text about that. Holy crap!
He texted you like, "Oh shit, I'm dead."
No, I saw a text that said something about that. Like somebody died, 93.
Well,
yep.
Vader.
It's a pretty good run. I do the math every time somebody in the 90s dies to tell myself I still got plenty of time left.
Yeah, the weird thing that's crazy is what's
he's
it
also
called?
In the Sandlot.
Yeah, he's in the Sandlot too. Holy crap! Yeah, but no, the other weird thing though is that he sold his voice's likeness to Disney.
Oh.
And so like they can use it for anything, and so like that way they have Darth Vader indefinitely. Simba. Yeah, they can make. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, they can make Lion King forever. But like, yeah, that's super interesting. Now that he's passed, I wonder like what'll happen around that. That's interesting. Sad to see him go. He was awesome, and it's funny. Yeah, he was in a lot of our childhood stuff.
Yeah,
he was. Yeah.
Last questions, I guess. How do you ensure that a villain continues to engage the audience throughout a story or series? And what are some techniques to keep them evolving, and unpredictable?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say you want to learn a bit more. I mean, I guess the villain takes actions that force the conflict, right? And so you do that at the same time. But if it's interesting action, right? If it's got a philosophical or emotional point to it, it's gonna really land. Whereas if it's just sort of a generic, I want to take over the world because I want to take over the world kind of villain. Those guys that want to destroy the world, I never understood that. Like, where are you going to live? Pizza or something at some point?
Pinky in the brain.
But no, he wants to rule the world, not destroy it.
Rule the world.
And SWAT, which is the project that I zooped with John. or at the same time as John with Drumstick to Doom. I got my copy, by the way, if you're still out there. I liked it. But you know, the villain's actually in love with the hero, like, and it's kind of an anti-tragedy thing where she is a monster with one fatal flaw, and that is that she genuinely loves the hero. And so she's like learning about not being a monster to him. Like she really struggles with that at first, and then, you know, sort of grows as a person as you go through the series, and then by the end she's not. God damn it, I spoiled a bunch of stuff. Anyway, you know, emotionally engaging. You know, if they've got something interesting to say that kind of taps into a fear or a concern of the audience, then I think they're going to engage a lot better than sort of a generic "I just hate the world" thing. You know, like
that's interesting, because it's almost like if they're just a straight villain, you can predict what they do next, but because they have a flaw, that's what causes the variable. Like, did you ever hear of the show Elementary? It's like a Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
I actually love the show. It's a great show, but the interesting thing is there's a character in there who falls in love with the protagonist, and basically that's what makes them alter their actions. Like they should be doing this. Like it's like if their plan is to do this, it's logical to do this, but because of this flaw, they alter, like their logic gets skewed, their emotions get in the way. And it's like, yeah, I think that's
that's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, when the villain is, I mean, it's like, imagine, I don't know, a Scientologist, right? They have a completely different idea of what the hell is happening than a Catholic, right? In terms of, I don't know, you know, theology or whatever.
Yeah.
And if you have a villain that has a radically different worldview, that can be really interesting, because if you think it through from their perspective, they can end up doing some very interesting, strange things that you would not see coming, because they have a completely different worldview than most people. And so, you know, when you see like cultists who are all castrating themselves and then taking sleeping pills because they think a UFO's in the back of the asteroid or whatever, that's the kind of thing that can make really interesting villains, I think, because it's compelling, but it's also strange and disconcerting. Because that sort of thing taps into your fears about cults, and you know, we've all believed really stupid shit at some point that we then later realized was stupid. So probably have some idea of what it's like to have that kind of thing happen. So that would be one way to go at it for making an interesting villain, is just genuinely figure out like the Joker's kind of an anarchist, right? So, well, he's not kind of, he's definitely an anarchist.
Yeah, as I say, he's almost like the purest form of an anarchist, and what it could mean. It's like,
yeah. So if you take that, like genuinely committed to that, and then think it through, you can.
I do it. His flaws, interestingly, ironically, in this, or what is it? Coincidentally, on what we were just talking about, he basically loves Batman in the sense he makes life interesting. So there's been so many times where the Joker equally could have killed the Batman, but doesn't, because it makes his anarchist life interesting. So that's his flaw, because if he kills the Batman, then he gets to just get what he wants, which is to do whatever.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? So like, I just realized that's where his interesting take on, where like there's a moment where you see it, like he has the capacity to kill Batman right now. If he wanted to, he could stop him. Why doesn't he? This emotional flaw. And
yeah. I mean, it's also very convenient in terms of not having to kill Batman, but
it makes sense, as opposed to him just not being able, like as opposed to having the invincibility armor of the plot armor, right? Like I think that's a better way to do it. That the one character who has the capacity, for example, Bane breaks his back, and instead of killing him, he tells him why. He's like, I want you to suffer. And that was his flaw. Instead of it's like the monologue. I love The Incredibles when what's his face, Syndrome, is like, you caught me monologuing, right? Like it's that idea. You finally pointed out that, like, the thing that everyone's heard before. It's like, why does the villain always monologue? It's like, because they're hurting and they want to say it. And he's like, oh, you almost got me. Like I was trying to talk, and all of a sudden you caught me off guard. Like that's a villain's problem most of the time, is that because they have all this self-hurt or hatred or whatever it is, they feel the need to, have this moment where they're just talking and talking, and the superhero at the time always takes advantage of that. And that's why, like, that's a very funny cliche, but it's when there is something like the monologue, like in the case of the Joker, just wanting to keep the bats around, like that's an interesting way to not create plot armor, but make it so that, like you said, like it's very convenient to not kill Batman, so the story keeps going.
Yeah, you're right. That's the kind of, sometimes you gotta. It's a good trick if you can find interesting ways to kind of come at the hero's not going to die, but you've made it interesting because now it's out of the villain's love for the guy or the need for the Batman. That's a lot more interesting than, the stormtroopers just never being able to hit anything.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, would you go to Stormtrooper Academy? Can't land a shot.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I kind of at the point where, I want emotional context to everything, because when I'm watching a movie and like Captain America's just punching some guy, I don't give a shit. Like, I don't care. That person, that character doesn't matter. They don't have a mom. We're not going to see any of that. I'd rather watch two people talk across a table than just punch for no reason. So, that's me. So if that,
I think that's like
people, go ahead.
I was just saying, I think that's like what I mentioned before, where it's like really good villains very often don't need a background, but really good stories tend to come when the villain has a good background.
Yeah. I mean, there's two things going on. I mean, you had the iconicness of the villain is, I think there's a book I read called, it's like Modern Myths, something like that. And it talks about modern myths like Robinson Crusoe or Treasure Island, and why they had this weird hold on people. And one of the points they made was that there's a lot of gaps in it, right? Like the writing's not that great. There are angles where you can there's like space for fandom, I guess, right? Where you can come up with your own daydreams about being on the island, Treasure Island or whatever, Robinson Crusoe. Like there's a lot of lists in Robinson Crusoe. I don't know if I haven't read it in 30 or 40 years, but apparently there's just laundry lists of, anyway. So writing wise, it's not top drawer, but it has this major impact because it's not perfect. And I think that's kind of what you're hitting on, is like the really iconic villains have space for you to imagine your perfect version of that villain. Whereas once you've gone into the weeds and you understand, like why they are the way they are, there's a little bit of the mystery's gone.
Yeah, like the Luke, the Luke, I am your father, right? Like it's what could have caused him to become evil. Oh my God, like Luke's so good. Like, yeah, all of that thought is what makes that scene so memorable. Like in an instant, you're like 1,000 questions pop into your head, and it's like, whoa, what?
Yeah, and then exactly, and then you can go write whatever you want in your head, and then it's the perfect thing for you, and then everybody's happy, except that you don't get a box office for imaginary prequels, right? So you got to actually make one. But I think going back to Star Wars again, I feel like the problem with the prequels was that it hits all the points of the tragedy, right, that it's setting out to tell, but it's like it does it in a it's like malicious compliance. It's like, yeah, I fucking did it. All right, let's move on. And that's the problem, is that I think George wanted to make Luke Skywalker and the Crystal Skull pretty much, but he felt obligated to do the prequels, which is a story about a man voluntarily embracing like mustache twirling, force choking evil. That's hard to do.
Well, you know what's interesting about that? It's this whole idea where, like in that story, the Jedi are the good, the Sith are the evil, and in the first story arc, that's very obvious. But when they start to explore like how this good person would become evil, similar thing to the what's it called, Mr. Freeze? Like his wife's dying, he wants to learn how to save her, and basically the good people are like, no, like wait, what? Like you know how to do it, but you're not gonna know. Like, wait, what? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, you're like, yeah, you can't be tied to emotional things. It's like, well, I already am, and apparently I'm supposed to be the savior. So I don't know. I think maybe you should bend some rules for a couple seconds. You know?
Well, yeah, he could have even just taken her to a doctor. That might have helped.
Yeah.
You know, uh, it seemed really forced. You know, like you never really bought into the love affair. Like, you know, your love is like sand or whatever. You know, so it's just like he knew what he was supposed to do. He did it, but he did it in the lamest way possible because he wasn't really committed. And the problem with the sequel trilogy is it was just chaos. Nobody had any fucking plan whatsoever. And then it was just fan service for the last 2 hours.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's either that or like they had a plan and they're like, yeah, we can't fit all that into a movie. What if we just cut out huge chunks of it? And then like that doesn't work anymore. And they're like, okay, let's rewrite it then. It's like, okay, now it's not the same plan anymore. It's like,
well, it definitely, like, the first one's just kind of a recap of the original trilogy, like in a lot of ways. So they're which is we don't need to get into my whole rant about not being able to see the original trilogy. But anyway, they felt the need to do that because you can't actually watch the originals anymore, I guess. And then the last
oh,
Jedi,
you talk about like how they edited the originals?
yeah, I Han shot first. I don't want your CGI that you stuck in.
Greg, do you know what he's talking about?
Or
They edited the originals and made the bad guy shoot first and not Han Solo.
oh yeah.
This is kind of, I mean, that's kind of George Lucas kind of has a lot of grandpa in him. You know what I mean? Like he always did. I think the Star Wars holiday special, he had a lot more to do with than he'd like to admit, because there's a lot of stuff from there that you see in the later, like in Crystal Skull and the prequels. Howard the Duck. I mean, I haven't seen that movie since I was 6, but how the hell do you follow up Star Wars with that? So there's just, I mean, he's just kind of an odd dude. I don't think I think he's just a softie, really, and he just doesn't want, you know. I don't know why you would make that change, though. I mean, if somebody announces they're going to kidnap you and then take you to a guy who's going to dump you in a Sarlacc pit, I think that stands your ground time. Like, you know, anywhere in the universe, that's just a self-defense. You're not even. I never questioned it.
Yeah. Well, not only that, the whole point is Han Solo is not meant to be a good guy. He's more like I guess like an anti-hero as opposed to an anti-villain, like, you know, or whatever. Isn't anti-hero is the right word, right? Like he's the hero when he needs to be, not because he is one. Like he's just a guy. He happened to live a rough life, so because of that, he's like, you know, he does stuff that's questionably moral. And in this moment, yeah, he's like, I think these guys want to do some bad stuff, and they're bad people anyways. Bam, yeah, like he did something questionably moral that makes him an interesting character. You remove that, and
yeah, yeah. That the Jabba the Hutt CGI looks like it was done on a Commodore 64. I think. I mean,
the new one, yeah, like it's weird because the old visuals match the film footage. So if you update that, it doesn't match the film footage.
Yeah, I mean, it was unnecessary. And then, I mean, I don't know. I think the people who hate The Last Jedi and the people who think it's the best one are both right? Because, and I'm serious, because it was the best one out of those 3, because it was the only one that tried to do what it was supposed to do, but they shouldn't have tried it at all. And I think that's kind of you know, everyone's mad that they ruined Luke's life or ruined his ending, and that's fair, because why'd you do it for this shit? This is not good enough, right? But it was inherent in the concept, right? Because you end with everyone's happy. It's the mega happy ending. Evil is destroyed. Balance is returned to the entire universe or galaxy, right? Everything's perfect. And then, so for there to be a sequel, Luke had to fail, right? That was a false dawn, right? It had to be, or you don't have a story. So the people who hate The Last Jedi for revealing that are completely right. Like, this trilogy shouldn't have happened. You know, it was just, it should have been a lot better. But also, it's the only movie that wasn't kind of crap.
Nice.
That's my take on it.
We should have like one of these episodes, because first of all, I love doing this new style podcast that we're doing, just like trying to dive deep into a topic, because like even just during this, I've come to some realizations where I'm like, oh, that's good. I'm going to try to keep that in mind when we're writing and editing future comics. But I also like it because it comes up with new talking points. Like definitely, like Greg knows because I brought it up on 2 or 3 podcasts. Like my thoughts about like the live action Aladdin movie and like very specific problems with it. Same with Star Wars. Same with everyone's got like specific problems. I feel like eventually we need to have like just one episode where we just like destroy Star Wars at some point. It's like so many people that hate watch it,
I feel bad because I've been crapping on Star Wars the entire time, but it is kind of my guideline for bad writing at this point. It is. I mean,
you know what else it is too? It's like when you start off with something great, I think that's the reason. I don't think it's the worst writing ever, although it is very, very, very bad. There's definitely worse writing out there. It's more like, how do you take something that was so great and then do so much damage to it?
Yeah, nobody's still mad about Battlefield Earth, right? Because it sucked. It just sucked. There was never a moment where it was, amazing, and then they just sort of kind of drained it over the course of 30 years. So yeah, I mean, but I mean, that's what I mean. Star Wars is so powerful, right? Like even when the prequels were coming out after like Attack of the second one, I think is Attack of the Clones. I was like,
familiar.
Yeah, the second one, I'm like, I'm not watching any more of this shit. I will not go to the theater. I will not go to the theater. And that's where I was for the opening day of the third movie. It was in the theater.
Like this.
Yeah, I mean, it was like, I felt like, I mean, it's been a long time since I watched it, but there was like, it would get going for about 10 minutes. And then I think that's when Steven Spielberg was directing. And then there'd be like a record scratch, and then they'd shit on it. And that's when Lucas came back in. And then eventually it started gaining some steam at the end, and then shit. And
then you found out that steam was steaming hot shit.
That's my theory. I can't prove that, but there were like multiple times I felt in that movie where they were actually getting some dramatic momentum, and then there'd just be some moment to crap on it. And no, that's what I think. But yeah, but I mean, I'm like 80s kid, I guess, basically. And so Star Wars was everywhere. I mean, like that was the Iliad to nerds of the 80s, the 70s and 80s. And so it matters to me a lot more than it probably should, for the franchise where the fat guy's name is Porkins. So.
Cool. So where can people find you? And what is your little elevator pitch for your Kickstarter?
Okay, Edge of Darkness is it's a far future dystopia where everyone's living under the ocean, like I said, and so they live in this vast, like basically floating sponge that is just a sponge. Everything's biological. There's no metal. There's no anything. It has a really fascinating art style from Leonardo Romanelli, who's this guy. He's very Italian. He did amazing work with it. And it's emotionally, it's about basically kind of emerging from depression. I mean, that's the metaphor of it. Leonardo views the metaphor as conception, which also, crossed my mind. So it's a far future dystopia about a guy who's just kind of got a crappy job, and one of his friends commits suicide, and he decides to lie about it. So his family gets his life insurance benefits, basically, and that kind of kicks off a whole thing of pretty crazy adventure. So religious, it has a lot of religious overtones but I basically grabbed Egyptian religion and put it in the far future, deep underwater. It changed a few things. Actually, well, it's kind of a weird sect of it's interesting. Go check it out. The art's awesome. The story's fun. And my wife thinks I invented a new subgenre of sci-fi. I don't know if I have, but I can't think anything offhand that's just like it.
Did you come up with a name for the subgenre?
No.
You name it. Like that's a big thing where like in music, there's always like avant-garde, which is the new stuff, and then once it gets named, then it gets immortalized. You got to get it named, like when you name.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'd like someone besides my wife to think that it's a subgenre before I start coming up with names for anything. But you know, it's definitely unique. It's very unique in art style, and I don't think there's a lot. I have not seen anything like it in the comics world in a while. You know, so check it out. We have 6 pages. We got a bunch of stickers. We have 6 or 7 pages that you can look at, and if you think it's interesting, you know, get the PDF.
Cool. Okay, well, thanks for coming on, and everybody can back the Kickstarter by clicking the link in the show notes when it actually goes live, which will be this Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern. It was noon, and because of Dylan's new graphic, it's now going to be that time because that just makes more sense. So, and I don't have to rush to do something. So, all right.
Well,
thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Cool. Talk to you later.